Did you know that Africa was mapped centuries before European explorers even set foot on its shores? Forget the image of a dark continent waiting to be discovered. The story of African maps is a story of knowledge, power, erasure, and ultimately, the redrawing of a continent's destiny. We begin our journey in the 2nd century CE, with Claudius Ptolemy, a Greco-Roman writer based in Egypt. His Geographia became a foundational text, influencing European map-making for centuries. Ptolemy's work, while groundbreaking, wasn't without its flaws, and his depiction of Africa would be debated and revised for generations. Now, let's fast forward to the 8th to 15th centuries. While Europe was in its so-called Dark Ages, Islamic scholars and traders were busy charting North and West Africa. Their detailed knowledge, fueled by trans-Saharan trade routes, provided a very different picture of the continent. These weren't just lines on parchment, they were vital arteries of commerce and cultural exchange. Consider the Catalan Atlas of 1375, created by Cresques Abraham. It offered surprisingly detailed depictions of parts of Africa, reflecting the knowledge circulating at the time. Even the Chinese, with their Da Ming Hunyi II map of 1389, included Africa, though their understanding was largely indirect. But everything changed beginning in the 15th century. The Portuguese, driven by a thirst for trade and empire, began exploring the West African coast. Ceuta in 1415 was an early conquest. Bartholomew Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, opening a sea route to the east. Suddenly, Africa's coastline was being mapped with increasing precision. By 1570, Abraham Ortelius published Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, the first modern atlas, standardizing European cartographic representations of Africa. But look closely at these maps. Notice how the coasts are detailed, while the interior remains vague, often filled with fantastical creatures and speculative features. This wasn't just due to a lack of knowledge. It reflected a deliberate strategy. European powers were primarily interested in coastal trade, especially the slave trade. The interior was largely left blank, reinforcing the idea of an empty continent ripe for the taking. As we move into the 18th and 19th centuries, the nature of mapping shifted. Rivers became crucial, serving as highways for trade and conquest. Missionary routes, military expeditions, and the insatiable demand for resources fueled the push inland. The infamous Berlin Conference of 1884–85 formalized the scramble for Africa. European powers carved up the continent, using maps as tools to divide territory. These weren't just lines on paper, they were decisions that would have devastating consequences for generations. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, colonial maps reflected administrative borders, often ignoring existing African political systems and cultural boundaries. The year 1960 is remembered as the Year of Africa, with 17 nations gaining independence. But even then, the colonial map persisted. New nations inherited borders drawn by European powers, setting the stage for future conflicts. The Sharpeville massacre in South Africa that same year exposed the brutal realities of apartheid, further shaping how the continent was represented politically. But let's not forget the crucial point: Africa was not a blank slate before European arrival. Arab, Berber, Persian, and Indian Ocean trade networks had long documented African geography. Knowledge of the Niger River, Lake Chad, and trans-Saharan routes circulated through Muslim scholarly and commercial circles. The idea of a completely unknown Africa was a political fiction. Many African states and trade systems were well known locally and regionally, but European mapmakers often erased or minimized this complexity to justify their imperial ambitions. From the 18th century onward, mapping was inextricably linked to extraction. Maps served slave trade logistics, missionary routes, military expeditions, and resource extraction. The goal wasn't understanding Africa, but controlling it. Tragically, many of the borders on modern African maps are colonial artifacts. These lines were drawn with little regard for ethnic, linguistic, or ecological boundaries. Straight-line borders cutting across deserts and savannas are a stark reminder of European negotiations, not African consensus. Yet, when trade was desired, historical African states were sometimes accurately depicted. Kingdoms and empires like Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Kanem-Bornu, Ethiopia, Congo, and Benin were labeled or represented when they mattered to commerce, diplomacy, or war. Otherwise, vast regions were reduced to vague terrain or decorative imagery. So how did maps shape European expansion into Africa? Cartography became a tool of navigation, conquest, taxation, and administration. European empires used maps to claim sovereignty, plan military campaigns, negotiate borders, and identify valuable resources. Maps reshaped African political reality, transforming a continent of diverse political systems into a set of colonial territories. The act of mapping often preceded or accompanied treaty coercion, military occupation, boundary enforcement, and land alienation. Many modern border disputes can be traced back to colonial mapping decisions made with incomplete information or deliberate strategic distortion. European maps often presented themselves as objective science while embedding imperial priorities. They could accurately document coastlines while simultaneously omitting African sovereignty, renaming places, and centering European roots. This created a powerful false narrative that Africa was only made legible through Europe. But as African states gained independence, they inherited this colonial map. To avoid wider conflict, many accepted colonial borders, preserving cartographic boundaries created by empires that no longer existed. This has had long-term effects on ethnic distribution, national identity, resource allocation, cross-border conflict, and regional integration. Even today, border disputes like those between Ethiopia and Eritrea, Sudan and South Sudan, and Cameroon and Nigeria reflect the legacy of colonial cartography. Digital mapping is now becoming politically important. Modern African states rely on GIS, satellite mapping, and digital cadastres for land registration, urban planning, disaster response, mining governance, election logistics, and infrastructure development. The control of geographic data remains a crucial issue, especially in rural land rights and extractive zones. But African institutions are also reclaiming their spatial history. Universities, archives, and libraries are digitizing old maps to recover pre-colonial place names, document trade routes, and study colonial boundary formation. There's growing interest in indigenous cartography, oral geography, sacred landscapes, pre-colonial urbanism, and historical trade corridors. It's about challenging the old blank map narrative and reclaiming control over their own history. The story of African maps is a reminder that maps are not neutral representations of reality. They are powerful tools that can be used to shape perceptions, justify conquest, and erase histories. By understanding the history of African maps, we can begin to decolonize our own minds and see the continent in a new light.